Happy Sunday, everybody. Hope you're doing great as we wind down 2023. This question for this musing sounds probably far more provocative than it actually is. I'll begin with a disclaimer. From everything I've seen and heard, Elder Kearon is a sincere, genuine, amazing, worthy, qualified individual to serve in the quorum of the 12 apostles. So I'm excited to kind of see what he talks about and how he ministers and everything else. This musing, the topic of this musing, is perhaps rather nitpicky, this question of whether he's a valid apostle or not. You could call it nitpicky, but I think it's also very substantive, and it speaks to perhaps some changes that have been made in church governance or process. So I'll just cut straight to it. The question that I have, the thing that I've been musing about over the past few days since Elder Kearon was called to be an apostle, comes from Doctrine and Covenants, section 20, verses 65 to 66. And so this reads, "No person is to be ordained to any office in this church where there is a regularly organized branch of the same without the vote of that church. This establishes the process for what's called common consent for the leaders of the church. It's very well known." A little bit of context behind Doctrine and Covenants section 20, it's kind of a constitution for the church. It outlines the kind of church governance, the process. It was almost like an early handbook for church members to guide the affairs of the church. It wasn't in the voice of the Lord. It wasn't a voice of an angel, like most of the other sections are. Instead, it's more of a we the people, kind of like of the Constitution. Instead, in this case, like it says in verse 16, it's we the elders of the church. So it is more of kind of more of the members kind of saying, here's how things going to go, here's our Constitution. Now in section 20, it does three things. The first one is it kind of talks about the church's existence, history, background, why the church has come into existence. The next chunk of verses are kind of like the articles of faith. It outlines why we believe what we believe, how we know these doctrines, and it's got this kind of lofty, references to the things that we believe. And then the rest of the section deals with, qualifications for baptism, how to administer the sacrament, duties of priesthood holders, how to manage the records, and all that kind of stuff. And it's in that latter part of the section where we find the reference that I read. Again, briefly, it says that no person is to be ordained to any office in this church without the vote of that church. What does it mean then to ordain someone? It's kind of a funky word, perhaps. So if we go to the church guide for the institutional definition of what it means to ordain someone, it means to appoint or confer authority or office. So basically it's finalized. Once you're ordained, you now have the position. You now have authority. So an apostle can be called, but then the ordaining is when things officially, like you're officially in that position and you have the authority. So Doctrine and Covenants 20 establishes that no person can be ordained without a vote. So then we go to the December 8th press release, just over a week ago from the church. It announced that, quote, Elder Patrick Kearon was called and ordained as a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. Elder Kearon, age 62, was ordained on Thursday, December 7th by President Russell M. Nelson and the other members of the First Presidency in the Quorum of the 12. Interesting. So he wasn't just called. He wasn't presented for a sustaining vote. He was ordained without a vote of the church. Now, I'll get into some exceptions and some nuance in just a moment that might suggest why it was done this way. Emphasis on might. But before going there, I want to point out that even Joseph Smith had to wait in order to be ordained. Here he was commanded by God, him and Oliver, to ordain one another to the priesthood and start building the church. But even he had to wait. So I'm going to read from a BYU Studies article that kind of summarizes this. Joseph and Oliver were instructed to ordain each other to the office of elder, and then to ordain others as it was made known unto them. Their ordination was deferred, however, until, quote, such times as it should be practicable to have our brethren who have been and who should be baptized assembled together, when we must have their sanction to our thus proceeding to ordain each other, and have them decide by vote whether they were willing to accept us as spiritual teachers or not. So even Joseph Smith, the founder of the church, the one restoring this, the one directly commissioned by God as the founding prophet of this, generation, even he had to wait for a vote of the church. Elder Orson Whitney has a quote on this I found interesting. He says, "What?" exclaims one, meaning like someone might say, "What? After these men," Joseph and Oliver, "after these men had communed with heavenly beings and received from them commandments for their guidance, and after receiving divine authority to preach the gospel, administer its ordinances, and establish once more on the earth the long absent church of Christ, after all this, they must go before the people and ask their consent to organize them and preside over them as a religious body?" Yes, he says. Yes, that was precisely the situation. Notwithstanding all those glorious manifestations, they were not yet fully qualified to hold the high positions unto which they had been divinely called. One element was lacking: the consent of the people. Until that consent was given, there could be no church with these people as its members and those men as its presiding authorities. The great ruler of all never did and never will foist upon any of his people in branch, ward, stake, or church capacity a presiding officer whom they are not willing to accept and hold. Fascinating, right? Here's Orson Whitney basically doubling down on what Joseph Smith himself recognized, that even when there is a direct, clearly divine call directly from God, you cannot proceed without the consent of the people, which God himself said, section 20, right, saying that this is exactly what is needs to happen. Again, I'll read, "No person is to be ordained to any office in this church without the vote of that church." Continuing from the BYU Studies article, it says that on April 6th, 1830, Joseph Smith, Oliver Cowdery, and members of the Smith and Whitmer families gathered in Peter Whitmer's home in Fayette, New York, to organize the Church of Jesus Christ. It was anticipated that at this gathering, Joseph and Oliver would be ordained elders. Before that ordination, however, Joseph and Oliver needed to receive a sanctioning vote from those present. And then it says, let's see, who are they quoting here? It says, according to previous commandment, and that's a reference to the section 20 verse that we've been reading. So according to previous commandment, the prophet Joseph called upon their brethren present to know if they would accept himself and Oliver Cowdery as their teachers in the things of the kingdom of God, and if they were willing, that they should proceed to organize the church according to the commandment of the Lord. To this they consented by unanimous vote. Joseph then proceeded to ordain Oliver an elder, after which Oliver likewise ordained Joseph. Okay, so even the founding prophet could not assume his priesthood office without having the voice of the people, without having a sustaining vote. Let's go to the church manual itself, which establishes, or not even establishes, in reference to Doctrine and Covenants, section 20 that we've read, outlining the process by which ordination can happen. This, for those of you keeping track at home, this is section 18.10.3. It says that after a brother has been interviewed and found worthy to be ordained to a priesthood office, he is presented for sustaining. And then they cite section 20, the same verses that we're here talking about. Brethren to be ordained elders or high priests are presented by a stake presidency member in the general session of stake conference. Brethren to be ordained deacons, teachers, or priests are presented by a bishopric member in sacrament meeting. Well, of course, 70 and apostles, it's done in general conference. And importantly, it's important to note, this relates to an ordination to a priesthood office. So you might say, oh, well, it's elder and high priest, and apostles are just high priests. That's the office. They've already been high priests, so they don't need, No. The church's own manual says that the offices of the Melchizedek priesthood are elder high priest, patriarch, 70, and apostle. And being an apostle is a specific office. Again, I will read you section 20. No person can be ordained to any office in this church without a vote of that church. Continuing in the church manual. The person who conducts the sustaining asks the brother to stand. He announces the proposal to ordain the brother to the priesthood office. He then invites the members to sustain the proposal. Interesting. Here's a couple paragraphs down, a paragraph that we should work through and say, does this apply to this particular instance? It reads, in some cases, a brother may need to be ordained an elder or high priest before he can be presented in stake conference. When this happens, he is presented in his ward sacrament meeting for sustaining. He's then presented in the next stake conference to ratify the ordination, adapting the process for sustaining. So instead of sustaining, you're now ratifying an ordination. This includes giving stake members an opportunity to sustain or oppose the action. So a couple things to point out here. The first is, it says in some cases, a brother may need to be ordained an elder or high priest. Maybe he's leaving on a mission, right? He's got to be ordained an elder and then get out to the MTC or something, right? Or maybe he's going off to war, or who knows, right? There could be cases at this point out where, so even though DNC 20 doesn't have an asterisk or doesn't create exceptions, the church manual here is saying, well, okay, in some cases we're going to have some wiggle room. But even in those cases, even if someone, quote unquote, needs to be ordained before the next stake conference, you're still presented, according to the manual, in ward sacrament meeting. There is still a sustaining of a congregation, a body of church members, those who would be in part, governed by that person or whatever you want to call it. So that's interesting. The question then becomes, in my mind, is there a need to ordain Elder Kearon before the next general conference? I think it's a reasonable assumption to say, well, no, we can wait. The office can remain vacant for, 4 months until April. And so another important thing to point out here is this is not the first time, actually. From what I've been able to surmise so far, I've identified 2 past examples, both Elder Maxwell and Elder Holland. So Elder Maxwell was ordained in July, and then he was sustained at the next general conference. Interestingly, in that case, it was because the first presidency under President Kimball was languishing. They were old, feeble, unhealthy. And so that's when President Hinckley, or then Elder Hinckley, was called to be a 4th member of the first presidency, a rather unconventional situation. That created a vacancy in the Quorum of the 12, which they filled very promptly by calling and ordaining Elder Maxwell. And so, and little trivia there, that meant there were 16 apostles. Right now, typically there's 15. There's the 3 in the first presidency, the Quorum of the 12, who are all apostles. But in Elder Maxwell's case, he became the 16th apostle until there was another death. But Elder Holland, he was called on June 23rd, 1994. He was called and ordained on the same day. President Benson had died a few weeks prior. The week after he died, the first presidency was reorganized, and then in mid-June, they called and ordained Elder Holland. So it is unclear to me why there is any need to do this. The church manual itself more focuses on elders and high priests because, of course, the manual is, primarily written for lay leadership. Perhaps there's some general authority manual that we don't have access to that has this type of verbiage, but here's what you do with an apostle, or here's what you... So I know of no such thing existing, though it might, because again, the manual is silent as it pertains to 70 and apostles, what you do in that regard. Okay, so the whole point is this. Again, nitpicky, and why do I say that? Because even had they waited, so right now what's going to happen is that he was already ordained, and so we're going to get to the April General Conference, and they're going to present the leaders for a sustaining vote. He's going to, everyone's going to say yes. except for maybe those rabble-rousers that sometimes sneak into General Conference to shout, no! But everyone's going to sustain him. So this isn't a question of like he shouldn't be an apostle, or we should reject his sustaining proposal, or the proposal to sustain him as apostle. That's not at all what I'm saying here. Like, you know, when was the last time an action of any significance was rejected by the membership of the church? These people, we all kind of feel like, oh, this is all inspired and it's what God wants. So, you know, the sustaining vote just turns into kind of a perfunctory tradition that doesn't really hold a lot of weight with people. It's this almost robotic process that lacks substance or meaning in a lot of ways. You hear occasional anecdotal stories. Oh, yeah, 30 years ago, you know, when I was a kid in our ward, they tried to call this guy, and some of us knew that he was whatever. And so, like, you hear these infrequent stories. But by and large, everyone's just raising the right hand, which means in Elder Kearon's case, even had they waited, the church would still have sustained him, and then he would have been ordained. So this isn't an issue about Elder Kearon at all, in fact. This is a question about process. It's ultimately a question about common consent. So let's skip ahead a few sections, going from section 20 to section 28. And it says that all things must be done in order and by common consent in the church by the prayer of faith. So ultimately, this is a question about church process, and if we still are governed by common consent. If that even matters anymore, or if it's been hollowed out. President J. Reuben Clark, he has this quote where he said, "It is clear that the sustaining vote by the people is not, and is not to be regarded as, a mere matter of form, but on the contrary, a matter of the last gravity." And there are other similar quotes attesting to the fact that common consent is a foundational element of our relationship with God in his kingdom as members of his church. And if we treat it lightly or allow it to be potentially undermined, as it appears happens when someone is ordained without first having a sustaining vote, according to section 20, it cheapens, it diminishes, it undermines the importance of the law of common consent. It transitions the church more into an authoritarian governance model than a quasi-democratic governance model as envisioned by Joseph Smith and the Doctrine and Covenants. Well, what do I mean by that? I say quasi-democratic. Really, it's what Joseph, I think, when he was doing this Council of 50 stuff, which I still plan to do a musing on at some point, the term that they developed was theodemocracy. So in a traditional democracy, power is vested in the people, and they are the ones that govern themselves. Well, in a theocracy, power is vested in the Lord. The power is not in the people innately or inherently or inalienably. The power lies with God, but there is a democratic participation in the process. And so it's this blended theocracy / democracy, hence the term theodemocracy. And if we just blindly follow and do what we're told without questioning and don't take seriously, like think of it like voting in the government. I can't tell you how many times during election season I get texts and well, mostly texts, DMs and stuff from people who are like, hey, tell me who to vote for. And look, I'm not here to extol the virtues of voting. I think in a lot of cases voting is pointless and worthless and kind of depends on the context. And ultimately the state is an inherently counter-Christian and evil institution at its core. So this isn't about like everyone should vote and you know it's your civic duty and you're a horrible person if you don't vote. But for those who do vote and who do perceive that like you know they have the power and the obligation and the duty, I get all these calls from people who know that I'm politically involved and connected. And they'll be like, oh, who should I vote for? And I'm like, why are you even doing it? Like, sure, I'm going to tell you to vote for it because that just means one more vote for my guy. So I'm going to take advantage of the situation and tell you to vote for the right, you know, vote against that tax or vote for this or whatever. So sure, here's the information. But how sad that is that people who have this power don't appreciate it, don't actualize it. And perhaps the same could be said for us as members of the kingdom of God, members of the church, who have an element of power or obligation in the law of common consent to approve or, in some cases, disapprove of proposals of church leaders. And I think what it opens up is this recognition that the church is governed by men, well-meaning, often inspired, but not perfect, and not always inspired. And they may make mistakes, or they may try to call someone who they don't realize was a, child molester 20 years ago, or whatever, right? Like, mistakes can happen. It's like, a few decades ago when the church was acquiring these forgeries from Mark Hoffman, and these are well-meaning, sincere people, but they're not perfect. And so it's almost like a release valve that the Lord has created for the law of common consent to say, yeah, I'm going to call you, and in general, everyone's going to raise the right hand or whatever, but we're going to create a process where we're going to democratize the buy-in so that if anyone out there in the masses has reason to believe that there's a significant problem, they have a meaningful opportunity to engage and to protest and say, well, no, this isn't right for, X reasons. So theodemocracy. And here's President Clark again saying this is a matter of the last gravity. This is super important. We don't want an authoritarian church where we are just sheepishly following along with whatever we're told because we assume that literally everything is from God without the nuance of what's accurate. And that is, not everything is from God. These are well-meaning people governing a, multi-billion-dollar institution, doing their best, but sometimes making mistakes or whatever, right? And so you and I are part of this process and should be appreciating and actualizing our role in the process. When Elder Kearon or anyone is ordained prior to being presented for a sustaining vote, it appears to me that violates Section 20, which stipulates that everyone has to be presented for a vote prior to being ordained to an office. And it further dilutes and violates the law of common consent. We don't really hear a lot about the law of common consent. Yeah, we raise the hand every week and whatever, like we go through the motions, but we don't really hear a lot, I think, about the law itself, this doctrine, or what President Clark again called a matter of the last gravity. I should do some homework on this. I'm just shooting from the hip and trying to recall over the past few decades any kind of substantial or meaningful discourse or discourses on the topic, and none come to mind, just trying to recall by memory. So I think this is something that's foundational. It's something unique. It's something powerful about how the Lord's church is governed. But if we are, again, it's like in the traditional government. If citizens are not meaningfully engaged in the voting process, it allows authority to increasingly be concentrated to the top. And it attracts, at least in the case of Caesar's government, it attracts corruption. People who can get away with a lot of bad stuff because they know that the voters aren't going to hold them accountable. You look at Congress, it's like 98% of them just get reelected because people just go vote for the incumbent, or they vote for whoever's yard signs they saw more of, or they vote for whoever has the right last name. Oh, he's a celebrity figure. He's a Republican like me. And people don't meaningfully engage in the process to hold people to account. Now, I'm not suggesting that our church leaders, we have this apex of centralized authority, even though in some cases, we do have a lot of authority centralized. But I'm not suggesting that attracts corruption or anything like that. The point, rather, is that just like in the traditional civic political government, in church government, we play a part. And we should not be an authoritarian model where we just assume that whatever is proposed or what we're told is inherently from God, always and forever, without exception, and we should just blindly follow and do what we're told, follow the prophet, trademark. Even though all those things are meaningfully important, they have nuance. And they have circumstances in which we need to evaluate and have the spirit of discernment and seek counsel from the Lord directly to understand whether that counsel is true and whether we do sustain. These are things that I think should be treated seriously and attended to as I think the Lord intended, but it seems like we've cheapened it a lot. So to wrap up here, again, none of this ultimately matters because Elder Kearon would be sustained anyways, so we're just quibbling over, 4 months of him being an apostle before he otherwise would have been. So it's not about Elder Kearon as a person or whatever. It's just about the process. And again, he's not the first. Elder Maxwell, Elder Holland, potentially others that I wasn't able to identify. This is just a question of process and this principle of common consent, and whether we're just going to let it go as a church and let it fizzle out, or if it should be, appreciated and actualized so that we're playing our part, playing our role, and doing what God wants us to do to meaningfully engage in the process and not just passively, obey and implement whatever we're told without engaging our minds and our spirits and discernment and wrestling with issues and evaluating and praying and all of those things, right? We as a church culture, it feels like, have taken a path of least resistance, which is just going through the perfunctory motions and robotically raising your hand. I think there's a better path. I think there's a higher course. I think we should be far more engaged, and I think consent matters. We'll see you on Christmas Eve. Until then, ciao.